Yeah, thanks for the invitation. Happy to be here with you today, and sorry to have missed the morning. It sounded very interesting. Okay, I'm going to focus on presenting mainly two lines of work that we're doing, but our approach is essentially quantitative work. Okay, and the pros and cons, that'll be for you to debate the pros and cons. I'm going to focus first on some work we did in what we call our Crea Pro project, which we had during about 4 years with several teams in France. And these teams, we all shared a methodology, which I'm going to show you. And each team did it with students at the university in their field, in their domain. So there was a team in the west of France that was with art students. At the university, there was a team of script writer students in Paris. There was a team of music composition students in Bordeaux, and there was a team in Aix that was design students. Okay, and we were interested to study the creative process as these students create stuff in their field. Not only students, but people who are recognized as creative workers in these fields who've achieved awards for their designs, for their scripts and movies and things like this. Okay, so our methodology consisted of three lines of work. First of all, we wanted to identify with expert interviews what were the steps of creative thinking that these people talk about when they describe their creative process and their creative work. Secondly, then we analyzed those interviews. I'll show you the kind of thing we did. Then we traced students' activity as they created stuff in their classroom at the university. And then we did some studies where we tried to check if we provide a pedagogical activity, if we can change how they process their creative work. After this brief overview, I'm going to just show you quickly, and if there's questions, I can go into details. I'll show you a couple of things about the epoch test and how it fits with this kind of work. And in case there is interest, well, I could show some stuff we're doing recently on the creative environment where people work, although I'll have to just open a different PowerPoint for a few slides. Okay, so in this main study, which involved a lot of research teams, I'll give you an example with the designers. 25 designers were identified as very creative in design, and they are professionals, and they were interviewed in a structured way, semi-directive interview with a set of questions we asked, and they described a key thing they designed and how they got their idea and how they worked on it, for example, and they talked about what kind of thinking skills, what kind of personality traits, what kind of emotional factors, what kind of environment was relevant to their creative activity. And so we got descriptions that they gave us. Many of the descriptions cited, for example, steps in the process, suggesting it wasn't exactly a linear process. And so this is one designer who said, there's no step where I draw and then 3D and then modeling. No, it's all in the same time. I use all these different means. I go back and forth between drawing and modeling, and then I start again. Okay, and so we tried to decode all this textual things. Of course, our technique is usually rather quantitative. So we had used this trope analysis, which is a linguistic textual analysis, and it takes all the typed up interviews and it looks for words that go together that we identified as part of discourse universes, we call them. And so we have lists of words that we identify that all concern, for example, evaluating your ideas, different words. And we form a list, and it looks through for all the words that come up. And so we form these different universes of discourse, like creative process, action words, creative cognition, when they talk about constraints, when they talk about environment, they talk about their emotions, they talk about their personality traits, these reference universes. And the numbers in red are for the 25 designers, how many words they cited in their interviews. So for example, you see that the creative process actions is the most cited universe of reference with 10,899 words cited. Sometimes the same word, cited by many people, okay? But they talk about it a lot. So, okay. And then we got individual subcomponents, for example, of the process itself, where if they talk about the beginning or the end, or they talk about back and forth, or they talk about stopping, making an error, for example, we describe these as different sub-universes. And so this is part of the interpretive task of analyzing these interviews, but afterwards we follow up with a quantitative counting method. Okay. And we asked them, also we had questionnaires for these designers, for example, or we also did the same thing with script writers, the same thing with visual artists. And so they had to describe, use a questionnaire, how much, for example, they felt that self-criticism or mental flexibility or divergent thinking was important in their work, okay? The whole goal of this was to create what we called an action model based on Dewey's action theory, in which we had obstacles, the process of doing, working with material, working with the social world, and emotional. So we had these, in yellow, these kind of lines of trying to understand what these designers were doing as they created. And we kind of organized what they said in this action-based model. This is work that was done together with Vlad Glavino also, okay? We have a similar model for scriptwriters, where we had interviews with scriptwriters. But the model's a little different. It's a little bit of a different story for scriptwriters. And then we have comparisons between domains. So we had the artists, designers, scientists, engineers, scriptwriters, and music composers. And you can see, for example, when you look at doing, several fields start with an idea, they work on it, and it leads them to a new idea. But like in science, they work on something, they get their idea, and then they work on it. Okay, so there's a little bit of a difference in the descriptive concept of the creative process. Okay, now let's go to step 2 of this project, where students are going to do something, and we're going to trace their activity. They're going to, for example, if they're art students, they're going to have a little notebook here. And every time they work on their project, they're going to check off what they did. And we're going to trace this activity as if they go step by step from the beginning till the end of their work. And you'll find here the descriptions that came out of all those artists and designers who had talked about the process. So we find here, this structured the tracing notebook, okay, from the first phase. Okay. So this person could check off several things. For example, they associated 2 ideas, they had an idea, etc. Okay. And they would also describe how they're feeling during the work session. Are they feeling certain emotions? Are they engaging certain aspects of personality like openness, so forth? And this is some of their notebooks, which is the open text notebook. So this is in it. They have a notebook that they keep, a diary, but they also do, every time they come to the studio or they work on their project, they fill in our little questionnaire, our little traceability thing. Okay. Here is a student who's been working 10 weeks to make a sculpture. This is a project in the student's master class, master level class. So this is, the student's not doing it for us. We're just tracing, we're just following along what they're already doing. Okay. Here's another student. This is a final sculpture. These were put on display in the university art gallery, but this is an example of the artist students. We have the design students designing posters for a campaign for recycling. We have the engineering students designing the kitchen for a camping car. We have composing students making musical compositions. Okay, so what we can do is we can take the different steps that they could have checked off in our notebook, And we can see when you check off a certain step, what do you tend to check off next in the next session? So it's like they check off that right now they're defining their problem. And in the next session, they tend to say they're documenting, getting stuff about what other people have done on this problem, for example. That's why there's an arrow. When you start to define your problem, the next activity you tend to do is document, for example. This is all the art students together. There was around 25 art students who were followed. However, among these art students, since we have an individual difference approach, we're interested in those who are the more creative and the less creative. Do they differ in their process? And so, as you might know, in France, we got a 20-point grading system. So if you get like 16, 17, 18, you're like a superstar, okay? And if you get like 10 or 11, you're living and breathing and coming to class, okay? So, and if you get less than 10, you're really making an effort to do nothing. Okay, so these are grades based on the final sculptures given by the art professors on how creative the work is. That's how we figure out at the end who is who. Then we pull back their notebooks and we compare their traces. Just look visually at this. These green boxes are the different activities they can do, and they're going to be in the same spot for the more creative students and the less creative students. The boxes don't move. What moves is the arrows that connects them. Okay, so this is the more creative students. You see, for example, well, I'll show you afterwards a comparison. And just look visually. This is the less creative students. You see that they got a lot more connections. They're moving around a lot more. It's very random in a way. What moves from what to what, okay? And it's not the same way. So for example, it'd be like saying everybody can go from here to some train station near here, but some of you are going to take the tube and change here or there, okay? And you'll get there kind of quicker. And other people are going to take the tube in the opposite direction. They're going to change 5 times, and they'll eventually get to the train station they're supposed to get to, okay? So it's a little bit like that. So here, if you compare the C plus and the C minus, for example, when they define a problem, what do they do next? The C plus tend to go get documentation about what other artists have done. The C minus tend to start thinking about the constraints they have and try to get an insight into what to do, okay? When you take a break, because this is an activity for us, that they take a break, okay? And, when you come back from the break, what do? If you're a C plus, finally, at the end of the weeks, but you don't know it yet, you tend to come back and start associating new ideas to your project. If you're going to be a C minus, you tend to come back and you start to assess how well you're doing so far and critique your work, for example. And they have different emotions. When you are engaged in divergence, if you're a C plus, you're feeling kind of positive, looking for different ideas. If you're a C minus, you're feeling stress and frustration as you're looking for these different ideas. So they experience the process phases differently. And in different fields, for example, I'll just show you this. In the engineers, we have the first 5 sessions and the last 5 sessions. They had 10 sessions in engineering class to work on these prototypes of kitchens for camping cars. And you see the green are the ones who will end up to be highly creative students in their production, and the blue are those who will be low creative. Well, you see that they start to differ a lot on how much they do different activities in the last 5 sessions, where the little stars are, okay? So they engage in some more activities, more parts of the process than others, okay? Okay, now, by the way, this is just a trace of 2 script writing students. This is one student in blue and 1 student in green. The one in blue ended up to write a script after 10 weeks. The one in green wasn't able to finish. They got stuck, okay? Now, in a educational study with art students still, we created 2 groups, those who were a little low on flexibility, mental flexibility, and those who were a little low on socializing and talking with others to get feedback, okay? And we gave them, as they worked, some boost activity to get them more flexibly thinking or to get them more in touch with others to get more feedback. So they had, based on the fact that they were lacking something, they had a differentiated pedagogy to help them out a little, okay? Okay. And so they started out, this was a class on engraving in metal, for example, and with acid and so forth, okay? And they had 6 sessions where they explored the medium of engraving. Then we found out who was needing more flexibility training, who was needing more social interaction training, because these are sub-processes. And they came in session 7 to start their personal project, which would go till session 12 in this art class. And then they had exercises to boost either flexibility or social interaction. And so they had some specific things to do for these exercises, like flexibility. They had to take a plaque of metal they had already worked in etching, and they had to rework it with their new topic, for example. Okay. In social interactions, they had to explain their work to somebody, and then the person would give them feedback that they'd have to implement, this kind of thing. And you see here, we are able to trace over the 12 sessions different sub-activities of the creative process, like experimenting, which is meaning trying things in our terminology. It means just try stuff. Yeah, okay. And you'll see that, for example, those who had flexibility training is the red group. Well, in session 8, they're showing more trying stuff, which is just after they had this exercise to boost them. So you can see a pedagogical intervention influencing the process trace. Now, just a quick view of some of our other work, more with children and also with young adults, on creativity measures, because it's linked to the process studies I just described. And in fact, when you do creativity measures, typically you could measure achievement, which is real accomplishment, but usually we ask people to do stuff and show us what they can do, so we call that creative potential. And because they were spontaneously doing nothing, and we say, what can you do? Show us, here's a task, do it, okay? And so you might know these, like the Torrance test, divergent thinking, the Wallach and Kogan test, divergent thinking, the Urban-Jelen test of drawing, which is more integrative convergence, and the RAT, which is more of an integrative type of task. Well, based on this kind of stuff, you got to realize that these tests focus on subparts of the global creative process. It's not the whole deal. And so when you say do it, first of all, it's not spontaneous, it's not natural. Second of all, it's a very limited task, so it's like sticking the thermometer into a certain part of the creative process and seeing how well you can do. So based on this idea, we developed the EPUC battery, which now consists of divergent exploratory thinking, which is one part of the process, and convergent integrative thinking, which is another part, like a creative synthesis thing and a creative divergent thing. We got it by domain. So we got the artistic graphic, we got the literary verbal, we got the mathematics, we got the social, we got the scientific, for example, we got the musical. So we're going to ask kids to do these 2 processes, engage them in a certain domain. And we have this in different languages. It's been used in some OECD study recently. 2 minutes, okay, great. And so just to show you, in the artistic domain, here's a kid who gave many drawings for a banana. So they were able to engage divergence and make 10 things. Is 10 good? Well, we got norms. So we know that a kid of this age in France can do about 9 on average. So this kid did 10, so it's a little better, okay? We give them a set of objects, they make one big drawing with them. That's convergent synthesis. These are drawings that are kind of typical with the objects we give, like a bedroom scene, a fishing scene, in France typical. Here's drawings that show a greater convergence, a greater synthesis component of the process, and unusual use of objects we gave. So here you have, for example, the samurai warrior, the kid said, and the sword is made out of a carrot and the little wood mannequin, and the body is made of a light bulb and his head is a fish. Here, obviously, we got a kind of a rabbit with light bulb feet and so forth. So kids can engage these subparts of the creative process more or less, showing more or less potential by domain. We can locate a kid in a distribution of what other kids did who are of the same age. This is like, if you see this distribution, normal distribution, 100 is an average person, 15 points standard deviation. If it sounds like an IQ distribution, it is, because that's what teachers and what psychologists know. They know the IQ thing. They know that if you're at 130, it's good. You're so-called gifted. Well, here it's the same concept. And here you have a kid who's got like a profile. So this kid on divergent graphic and integrative graphic is relatively strong. And on divergent verbal and integrative verbal, less strong. So this kid has a more artistic graphic orientation, showing that when you ask him to do parts of the creative process that we think are particularly important, the kid can engage. Okay. And so this has been studied in terms of psychometric modeling, if you know about that stuff. And it does fit that the different tasks we give go together to give us scores of like divergent verbal, divergent graphic, integrative graphic. And these things are not totally deconnected. For example, integrative verbal and integrative graphic, making a big drawing and making a big story, in fact, they're not totally distinct actions of creative work. Because in fact, some kids, when they make a big drawing, it tells a story, in fact, okay? Some kids not. But so there are connections between these domains. It's not totally domain specific, but we measure it at that level. And so that, I'm gonna say thanks for your attention. I didn't talk about our creative environment work, but I'll just tell you what it's about in 1 second, is that we put people in environments that are potentially stimulating to them, and we have them do some tasks, usually they're divergent thinking tasks, and we see if the environment boosts them up. But we don't work with real environments, we work in virtual environments, because we have found that to be a good model for what people would do if you put them in a real environment. And it's a lot easier for us to create a virtual room that's with blue walls or any color walls, because we just change a parameter and the walls change their color instead of painting the walls, if you understand. And so we found it to be a very good model, and people act as they seem to act afterwards in the real world if you really paint the walls. But we not only change the physical nature of the room, we can change how the person is represented by their avatar. And for example, if we put you in an avatar that looks creative, it will enhance your tendency to give creative ideas, for example. So I could show some slides on that, but it's a little bit extra. So that's it for...